Welcome back, everybody. We're going to continue with Chapter 4, Part 2. In Part 1, we talked about Piaget and cognitive development early in the infant, and we addressed some of his criticisms. We learned about attention and learning and numbers. Now we're going to move on to Vygotsky's theory and think about mind and culture. So remember that human development is often described as a journey that takes place that takes people along many paths, right? Piaget believed that for information processing psychologists, children make the journey alone. So remember, he's the lone scientist. The children are the lone scientists. That's Piaget. But other people, including Vygotsky, who's a Russian psychologist, he proposed that development is an apprenticeship in which children advance when they collaborate with others who are more skilled. So his is more of a skilled collaboration effort. So we're going to take a look at his information processing theory and see how it differs from Piaget. So our learning objectives in this section are: what is the zone of proximal development? Why is scaffolding a particularly effective way of teaching youngsters new concepts and skills? And why do children talk to themselves as they solve problems? So these questions probably don't make much sense now, but Vygotsky's theories are going to deal with these, and we're going to go over them in the next slide. And you've probably already done a lot of this. You just didn't know what the name was called. So we're going to dive into this and discover what Vygotsky's theory of mind and information processing is and see how it differs from Piaget's. So now we're going to look at Vygotsky. And remember that I want you to think about, how does Vygotsky differ from Piaget's theory? So Vygotsky believed that children advance developmentally when they are aided by someone more skilled. Now, remembering back to the last slide, what is Piaget's theory? So him and other information processing psychologists believe, for the most part, the child travels alone. They may have some influence or direction in culture and other people, but for the most part, the child travels alone. But in contrast, Vygotsky believes, his core beliefs is that the children advance when they're aided by someone more skilled. And the work of Lev Vygotsky, he was born in 1934, has become the foundation of much research and theory in cognitive development over the past several decades. And particularly because of this, he has become known as the social development theory. So when you think of Vygotsky, I want you to think of social development theory. And that makes sense, right? Because his is dealing with working with other people, right? Working with theirs more skills. So it's that social aspect. So he is the social development theory. And Vygotsky's theory stressed the central role of social interaction in the development of cognition. So that is his key. So Piaget is the lone scientist. Vygotsky's, the opposite. He leads the social interaction. So he's that collaborative work, okay? And he strongly believes that community plays a fundamental role in the process of making meaning. So when he says by making meaning is, right, is you could do things. I could, bake a cake or do something like that. But when I put a social aspect into it, and I have family and culture, and I'm making a traditional, cake from my culture, from my grandfather, I'm putting and making meaning to it. I'm putting something more skilled, more meaningful into it. So through that social interaction, it's what he believes is a fundamental role in that process of making meaning. And he had three main contributions, and we'll go over those now. So we have the zone of proximal development, scaffolding, and private speech. So what is the zone of proximal development? So the definition is the difference between what children can do with assistance and what they can do alone. So an example of that is if I gave a child a puzzle and I told them just to put together, how well could they put that puzzle together just by themselves? Now, let me add in me. How well could, if I come in and give them some, clues on how to do a puzzle, right? With some assistance now. how well would they do? So that zone of proximal development is the difference between what children can do with assistance and what they can do alone. So if I just give a little bit of assistance, that's a small zone of proximal development. If it's a lot of assistance, then it's a large zone of proximal development. But just remember, it's how much difference or how much help really, or how much success the children has with assistance and without. Is there a big gap, a small gap? So that's the zone of proximal development. The next contribution from Vygotsky is scaffolding. And you guys have done this, been a part of this, and maybe not even known it. So it's a style in which teachers gauge the amount of assistance they offer to match the learner's needs. So they don't want to give too much help where they're doing it for them, but they don't want to give not enough help where the student can't do it. So it's that gauging that need. So first they are going to see how much can they get, how much can they do, with little assistance, if they need to offer more to help them along, or back off because they're doing too much. So that's what scaffolding is. It's a style in which teachers gauge the amount of assistance they offer to match the learner's needs, so that you're right at doing what you need. You're challenged, but it's not too hard that you can't finish. So a teacher's going to help you more when you need it, and then back off as you gain the concept. So they may help you more in the beginning when you're first learning, and you're not understanding, to give you examples to help you understand the concept. But then as you practice and learn more, they're going to back off so that you can do it independently. So that's called scaffolding. And most teachers, and you probably experienced in all your class, even in this semester, at the beginning, I'm going to help you a lot, give you a lot of cues. By the end of it, I'm going to expect you to be able to do most of it by yourself, not maybe give you as much input, so that you have be able to, you've reached a point in the class that you should be able to reach those goals. You shouldn't need as much of assistance. So that's scaffolding. And then the last one is private speech. So basically what private speech is talking out loud our inner thoughts. So a child's comments that are not intended for others but are designed instead to help regulate the child's behavior. So sometimes it's, you need to hear it and think it at the same time. So you need to actually have that auditory input coming back through your ears to process and remember. So it's an intermediate step for self-regulation. Mimics adults, and you're giving instructions to yourself. So it's almost like you're becoming the teacher or the adult. You're saying it out loud, and as you say it and hear it, it allows you to process it a little bit better. So sometimes when we have a hard time understanding things, we still do this kind of as adults. When you hear it out loud, does it make sense? Can you understand it just by, sometimes you just need to hear the words and not just think them. So it helps them gain greater skills in internal thought. And gradually, as you get, better at understanding things and reading things, you can turn that into more of an internal thought. But private speech is a child's comment. So it's just basically saying them out, trying to give instructions to themselves so they can get auditory and internal cueing to understand the directions and the behavior that they need to be doing. So remember, Vygotsky is the social, social development theory, and that social interaction plays a huge part in making meaning. So unlike Piaget's notion that children's development must necessarily precede their learning, so remember Piaget's development first and then learning, Vygotsky argued that learning is a necessary and universal aspect of the process of developing culturally organized, specifically human psychological function. In other words, social learning tends to come before development. So he's saying that you learn socially, you interact, with your parents, you interact with your grandparents, you're learning that social cues. And then from that interaction, you begin to develop. So they're definitely different views in the same information processing area, right? So know the difference between Piaget and Vygotsky. So we'll just highlight these again. So the zone of proximal development. So remember, teachers and parents can provide structure that the child needs to tackle a problem. So basically in the zone of proximal development, they're assessing how much can the child do by themselves? How much assistance is needed? A lot or a little? So that's what the zone of proximal development is. And so that with knowing that, they can provide a structure that can allow the child to solve that problem. So Vygotsky's basic premise is cognition first develops in a social setting and only later comes under the child's independent control. So they're learning socially, they're learning from their teachers and parents. So if they're just in a corner without any assistance, they wouldn't learn. That's basically Vygotsky's. They need that social interaction. And how much of it is that zone of proximal development? How much can they do by themselves opposed to how much assistance they need? So let's highlight scaffolding again. So remember, as children progress, the teacher stops giving directions and begins only giving reminders. So that's that progression of assistance. So first is the zone of proximal is determining how much assistance is needed. So once they determine that, then they can progress, right? This teacher stops giving directions and begins only giving reminders as they become more confident, more independent, need less assistance, have a smaller proximal zone, right? Parents also use scaffolding. They use primarily verbal instruction in the United States, but both verbal instruction and gestures in India and Guatemala. So it depends on your culture how we pass along our skills. Do we use a lot of gestures and verbal instructions, or do like we do in India, do they do a lot of examples and mimicking and gestures? So how you use it, there's lots of different ways. You can use words, gestures, show the skill. But the basic concept of scaffolding is, giving us more assistance when they're first needing it, and then backing off as they start to master the skill so they eventually become independent with it. So it's that progress of assistance. It's a scale of assistance. Are you giving a lot or a little, and knowing when to back off when the child is mastering the skill? So the question is, will a child learn if the parent does all the work of solving a puzzle for her? Probably not, right? They need to practice and fail on their own. And then that allows the parent to come back in and say, okay, now I've assessed your proximal zone again. How much assistance do you need? I thought you needed less. I can come in and give you a little bit more, and then back off again. So that's that scaffolding. It's constant assessment. But if a parent always just does it and shows them, the child's never learning how to successfully complete it. They're never putting the steps together. They're never getting the right amount of assistance, because total assistance is not going to allow that child to learn. They need to have that balance of a little bit of assistance and being able to do what they know, using what they know up to the point to where they need to get over the little bumps to get over to the next part of the knowledge. So that's what scaffolding is. So now let's highlight private speech again. Can you recall what that was exactly? So yes, private speech is when the child is talking to themselves, right? Giving themselves instructions as if they were the adult telling them what to do. Private speech comments that children give themselves to help regulate their own behavior. So it's almost they're mimicking what they've heard adults tell them. So let's think about it. When you see a child play, you hear them talk out loud a lot, telling themselves what to do. So if they're playing by themselves, they may say, okay, their name is Sally. Okay, Sally, put the block on the red block. Now take that yellow block and put it on top of that. So they're telling themselves, like they're mimicking what an adult says. And pretty soon, after they started, they're hearing it and thinking it at the same time, as that skill becomes more developed, then it becomes into inner thought. They don't have to guide themselves constantly. Now, have you ever tried a new thing and you start talking out loud and talking to yourself when you may be trying a new skill, or you're reading instructions to put something together that's difficult? We still revert to it when sometimes it's a skill that's new, because hearing it and reading it and thinking it, you're getting 3 different inputs. So it's helping to make meaning and put the picture together so that you understand it fully. So we still do it in certain aspects when something's new, but that's how children really learn how to control behavior, gain skill, all those great things, and eventually becomes into inner thought and speech. So now we're going to move on to language. So language is so universal, right? No matter what language you speak or sign language, it's the way we communicate. Well, how did we develop language? Where did it come from? How did we get from crying as our primary language to using, words and gestures and the full-on vocabulary? So let's take a look and delve in and see how we start to develop language and why is it so important to hit these milestones for later development in children, adolescents, even into adulthood. So let's take a look at the learning objectives that we want to accomplish as we review language. When do infants first hear and make speech sounds? How do children learn new words and word meanings? How do young children learn grammar? And grammar is a huge, you're going to find it is so important because if you don't learn grammar, you're going to find there's a certain age group that if you don't learn grammar, it's going to be difficult your whole life. So grammar is huge and it's a very hard concept for young children to get. So it's very important that we stress and learn grammar at an early age. And how well do youngsters communicate? So let's delve in and see how we learn the beautiful ways we communicate and language. So I want you to think back on as you're playing with your infant or you've been around it as a young child, or maybe not yourself or just seen this. How do babies communicate? How do we communicate to babies and infants? Do we use a lot of gaga, baba? Do they babble like that? Do we sometimes talk in baby talk? Do they ever try to mimic us? Right, those are all the ways that infants and babies learn sound. They're listening and observing to the language and the sounds that are around them. They may not understand what we're saying or maybe not be able to reproduce the actual words, but they are starting to mimic the sounds. And they know that words have meaning. They know they mean something. They don't know exactly because basically what language is putting a symbol, which is a word, to an object, an action, a person. So until the words have meanings, those symbols have meanings, the infant, the child doesn't know that yet. But they do know that sounds come out and they do know that that's trying to express some kind of information. And as the more they hear the word, the more that they're going to be able to learn and associate it. Whenever time I say, bottle, and they see bottle come up, they're going to realize that word, that symbol relates to the object. So that's the whole process of restarting to get in speech. So what are those sounds called? They're called phonemes, and they're unique sounds that can be used to create words. And they found that even newborn infants, because they hear so remarkably well, and the left hemisphere of a newborn brain is sensitive to language, and that's that Broca and Wernicke's area. So remember, the Broca is for spoken language, and Wernicke's area is for understanding language. So that brain is really sensitive. So it's ready to make all those connections. Those synapses are ready to fire to start understanding and putting the sound and associating the word to meaning. So they're ready to do that because they have great hearing and it's really sensitive to get that information. They can start to distinguish basic speech sounds. So those basic building blocks are phonemes. And what are some of those sounds? So we think of consonants and vowels. So sounds such as, t and toe or tap, or p and pat or paw. And sometimes the vowel sounds such as the sound of E or and get and bed, right? Infants can distinguish many new sounds. And they, like I said, they can differentiate between different sounds as early as 1 month. So that's why it's so important to really talk to your infant, your baby, get them engaged because they're going to have such better language skills if you're talking and interacting and you're associating the toy when you play with them, you say the toy. You show the toys. That's how they're going to learn language. They're going to hear the word, associate it with the object, associate it with the action, and their language skills are going to become much more developed. So what they found is that infants can distinguish phonemes not heard in their native language. So since the brain is so open to development and the child has no perspective, He doesn't know language yet. He's learning. Everything is new. Everything is different. So there really is no native tongue until it's established. So that brain is open to distinguishing every sound that you can think of. And think of languages when we think of Spanish and English. Are there some sounds that you say in Spanish that aren't said in English? Right? So if you're an adult learning a new language, like as I taking on the task to learn more Spanish, that's going to be hard because my brain is hardwired to hear the sounds of English sounds. Now, if it's infant, they have no idea. So they're going to hear every sound, and they're not going to distinguish it until they have heard their native tongue long enough, and that's about 10 to 12 months. So they use the example in your book about the Japanese and how in Japanese, they don't have the consonant sound of a R, like in rip, or the sound of an L in lip. But babies can hear that. They can hear R's and L's up until about 6-8 months. So if they're hearing English or they're hearing Japanese, they can still distinguish those because they haven't set down their hardwired language patterns yet. They haven't established a native tongue. But about 6 to 8 months, still at that 6 to 8 months, they can distinguish the sounds pretty equally between the English R and L and between not hearing that in the Japanese. They can tell, they can still say, oh, I can hear that and hear the other one. But like I said, by 10 to 12 months, that perception, if they're going to agree native tongue, is going to be English. And they're going to hear more of that English, they're going to lose that perception of the R and L. And because they hear those sounds more frequently. And in the Japanese babies are going to, lose that R and L because they're not going to hear that. So if you're taking that Japanese baby and you're taking that American baby and you're exposing them, say you're taking them to a class and they're hearing they're hearing Japanese and they're hearing English, but they go home to their American families and their Japanese families. At about 6 to 8 months, they can distinguish both. They can still hear the R, the L, no matter what language they're in. But at about 10 to 12 months, when they start to go, you're going to notice that the American babies that have been experienced to English are going to have a little bit better, they're going to be able to distinguish the R's and the L's. And then the Japanese babies, because their native tongue now, as they've been exposed to Japanese, they're going to lose that ability to be able to do R's and L's we that's when you start to really imprint on your native language. It's about 10 to 12 months. Same way with, faces. How we said that babies can distinguish human faces as they start to, get at this age. And at first it doesn't matter what, they can distinguish between different ethnicities. And then at about the stage, about the same time, they are starting to really recognize what's their native ethnicity, more so over the non-native. So same way in language. The exposure to the language leads infants to a more refined notion of sounds that are important in their own environment. So think of all the concepts we learned. Those schemes, they're categorizing the sounds and putting them into what's important to make sense of their world. Just like they did objects, the sounds and the letters, they're doing the same thing. So at about 10 to 12 months, if they're not, speaking Japanese and they're getting very little influence, maybe an hour a week, say we took this class, they're going to say that's not important, and they're going to prune it out, right, synaptic pruning, and become more efficient in the native tongue that the brain has learned. That's what they have to learn. They need to understand those sounds. They're putting those into important categories. So it's the same idea of the face recognition and everything. That brain is categorizing and making sense of the environment for language, for object meaning, for people meaning, all those things. So same thing with language. Language is just a little bit more complex. So it's really quite interesting. So that's why it's so hard as adults for us to learn a new language, because our brain has become hardwired and efficient to block out those sounds that aren't native to our language. So for all of you people that have tried to learn a language later on in life, you can relate, right? And think about those that are bilingual that learned a language, 2 languages at the same time as you were growing up, how much easier it was for you and how much easier it is for you to hear those 2 different sounds, because it's almost like you have 2 native languages because you were exposed to so to both of them frequently enough that your brain put two categories in there, put two languages that are important, and you were able to keep both of those sounds. So it's amazing how much we set in our first 10 months in our brain on how we're going to learn and process language and sounds. Because about 10 to 12 months, we've basically set what sounds that are going to be able to really distinguish and hear by what we're exposed in our environment. So very, very interesting. But important to know is that up until about 6 to 8 months, they can hear, distinguish all sounds from all languages. And about 10 to 12 months is when that native language becomes the permanent kind of software in the brain, and that those other sounds that are important kind of get synaptic pruned away. And as an exposure to one language increases, recognition of those sounds, which are those phonemes, from other ones declines, because the brain is very efficient. If you're not using them and don't need them, they're going to get rid of it so that you can become efficient in the language that you use the most, or the languages that you use the most. So if you're bilingual, so that's one of the reasons why they really try to push early to being taught both languages early on, because your brain is really setting those that software for your future adult and young childhood. All right, so now we're going to go on to the next slide. So as we travel down this road to speech, how are these phonemes going to make sense? How do we make meaning out of them and give them some words? How do the infants categorize them and eventually give symbol and meaning to the sounds to eventually become words, to eventually become sentences? So let's take a look at that. So they know that at between 7 to 8 months, they are able to pay attention to words that they hear frequently. So something that they hear a lot, mom, dad, they're going to pay attention because that's a sound that they hear a lot. And then they're going to start paying attention. Because they're paying attention, they're going to start saying, oh, when so-and-so says mom, they're looking at, that's mom. Or you refer to yourself and you point to yourself as mom. So they start to understand and put the person with the word, the object with the word. So it starts to have meaning. So we're going to kind of go over on the pattern on how infants recognize these words, and they recognize them in a few ways down here. But just remember that the words they hear more frequently, the sounds they hear more frequently, they're going to pay more attention to. So if we're going to teach them, language, we're going to have to put sounds and repeat them, repetition, and show meaning and to those sounds and words. So you're going to have to show, like if I'm saying mom, I'm going to point to me if I'm the mom. If I'm showing this is a bear, I'm going to point to a bear. So they're putting all of it together. So some of the ways that an infant makes sense, because they're like, these are just sounds. How do these sounds turn into meaning? How do they turn into words? So the one way they do is they pay attention to stressed syllables. So that just basically means is when we say a word, some words we put the stress on the beginning of the word, and some we put it on the back end of the word. So stress syllables would be like donut. So you can say I'm saying more stress on the dough and less on the nut. Toothpaste, basket, right? So it's a stressed syllable, which is dough, followed by unstressed syllables. So they're going to pay more attention to that dough part. But when they hear that, they start to pay attention because they're hearing the different cadence of the word. Donut, it's a little gap in there. It makes the sounds, separates the sound so that they know that there's something, some meaning to it. It's putting those sounds in some kind of order, making it make sense to them. So that helps with the first part of understanding those sounds into actual words. Another way that they do that is identifying words at the beginning and ends of sentences easier, right? So we think about when just in a natural word, donut, we stretch and we pay attention. Same thing when we do a sentence. So if I was to say, mom goes to the store. So you can kind of see my inflection is more on mom and store. So they can tell that I've started a sentence because I've got your attention, and then I kind of give a little extra stress at the end of the sentence. So they're looking at the cadence. How do the words go together? How do the sounds go together? So when you go mom and I pause, they know, okay, that's one word. Those sounds have stopped. goes to the store. And then maybe I draw out store a little bit. Okay, they're putting in their mind. Those sounds had, again, they had a longer cadence, you held it longer and put more emphasis on it. So those are important. So they're starting to think, okay, that's the beginning. There's some important stuff in the middle, and that's the end. So they're starting to understand the cadence of we speak. So they may not understand the words, but they're understanding how we put them together. So when you hear kids babble and they're not making sense and they're going blah, 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 they're putting the stresses in the right spot, but they just haven't got the words together, the meaning. But they know that we speak in a certain way. We have stressors or inflections on certain words. When we talk in sentences, we put more stress on the beginning and the end of the sentence. So those are the first patterns that they're categorizing into their little schemes to make sense of language. So they're knowing that certain words have stressors on it, and those words I'm going to pay more attention. Sentences have a cadence to them. They have a rhythm in the way we say them, and we put more stress at the beginning, at the end. So then that starts to know when a thought ends. That's a whole thought, because I have a stress at the end and at the beginning and at the end. So they're identifying these patterns. And then they go and start to notice when syllables that frequently go together, right? We learn, if you think back to your kindergarten or first grade, there's words that, go together, right? You have bat, cat, fat, right? At, that at sound. Those A and T go together and makes a common sound. Those are syllables that go together frequently. So they start to form those, they're hearing those together. Those two syllables together start to make up a lot of words. Those aren't just sounds. Those are actually start to make up individual words. So they're starting to form and put those in the category. So they probably have an at category, So that's kind of how that language starts to develop. And then the last one is they listen to infant-directed speech. So what that basically means is speech that adults use with infants that is slow, has exaggerated changes in pitch and volume, and is thought to aid language acquisition. So parents and adults often help infants. We're the ones that help master their language. They need to hear language. They need to see us using language. They need to see us using the items we're talking about, pointing, touching, describing, so that they can put meaning to the words that make these sounds actually start to have meaning and categorize them into words. So the best way to do that is for adults to speak slowly. So they need to hear the different sounds. They need to hear the pauses in between words, and they need to hear the inflections on the words. And it attracts infants' attention because it's slower paced, and it accentuates changes, provide infants with frequent and strong language clues. Since they are learning to correctly put these sounds together into a word that has meaning. And that's an amazing thing to do, right? But it takes time. So what they found is that when infants can segment words more effectively when they hear them in infant-directed speech. And infant-directed speech includes especially good examples of vowels. So that's like that at, cat, bat, because those have a lot of the same vowel sounds. And that can help infants learn to distinguish these sounds, because vowels vowels are our rhythm in the sentence, right? Each vowel is kind of like a syllable, right? So by having a lot of vowels, they can tell the cadence of the sentence. The fat cat, went to the store. So those are all one syllable. So they're finding that rhythm. And the slower we talk, the more they understand and they mimic it. And eventually their brain will start developing, the more they're exposed to it. And then those words will become meaning. They will be able to say them mechanically, like their tongue and, all that mechanical, actual physical placement and stuff. But it starts with that infant-directed speech, slow and steady. So just remember that infants can, recognize sound patterns. They pay attention to stressed syllables, dough, nut, tooth, pace, and they pay attention to the beginning of the word. Mom goes to the store and the end of the word. So they hear the gaps in between the words, so that they're starting to learn that each of those sounds has some kind of meaning. Those groups of sounds has some kind of meaning. They notice syllables that go together frequently. At, cat, bat. And a repeated word, if you say it like in different ways while playing, will start to gain memory. So if I'm saying, the more you repeat the word, the more they're going to remember it. And the more ways you use it, the more likely they're going to remember it. So if I'm saying the cat goes, jumps up and down, the cat, gives you a hug, the cat flies. So they're seeing it doing different things. And the one thing that's constant is the cat. So because you said the word in 3 different scenarios, they're picturing, oh, the cat is the object, because their other things are different. So the more you can repeat a word in different scenarios, the more they're going to pick up on the meaning of the word. And how you talk matters is that infant-directed speech. So you want to read to the young infant, even when they're tiny, because they're hearing how you talk. They're hearing your cadence. They're hearing the sounds. And you want to talk out your actions, and you want to point to everything that you're talking about. And that's going to help develop speech and understanding of language. So this is just a picture to remind you that when mothers and other adults talk to young children, they often use infant-directed speech, in which they speak slowly and with exaggerated changes in pitch and loudness, so that the infant begins to hear what words and sentences and cadence all sound like, so they begin to develop and understand language. So on the road to speech, we know that infant speech develops gradually. I don't know any 2-month-old that speaks, and I'm sure you don't either, because it takes time for the brain to make those connections, to hear all the sounds that they need to hear, and to process that. So it's a process, and it develops gradually. Some of the key time frame on those is below. So just remember that at 2 months, babies begin to coo or produce vowel-like sounds. So this is important. This is important for the test. 2 months, babies begin to coo or produce vowel-like sounds. So they start to, we know, right? Ooh, ooh, ah, ah, right? You're starting to hear that sound. They can start to mimic that. Babbling speech-like sounds with no meaning emerge after cooing. So first you have the little cooing, which is the oh, those vowel-like sounds. Then you have babbling, which we talked about a little bit earlier. The mimicking speech, but not really forming words, ba, 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 da, 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 da. It becomes more elaborate as babies' experience with sounds become more elaborate. So as they hear you talk more, they start to pick up the cadence. They may go, ba, 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 da, da, ba, ba, ba. So they start doing those inflections. They'll put the stressors, at the beginning of the word, at the end of the word. Still not making real words or real sentences, but they're starting to mimic the cadence, the patterns of speech, knowing that it's supposed to sound a certain way, but they haven't put the meaning together yet. So first you have cooing, just the vowel-like sounds, then you have the babbling, and then the babbling becomes more advanced into actual patterns of real sentences, but not real words. And this is all a precursor to real speech. So they're learning the sounds, they're learning how the sentences cadence goes, where we put our inflection on words, how we talk, probably even gesturing and mimicking that as well. And that's all a precursor to get ready for speech. The mouth is learning how to make those sounds, the actual mechanics, the muscular and neural connection, right? How to put the thought to actual forming a T and forming your lips together to make a P, a P. So all of those things have to happen before we get real speech. At 8 to 11 months, babbling becomes like real speech because they can vary pitch of their speech. So remember that. So that's when about 8 to 11, it becomes that ba, 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 ba. They start to talk like us. Okay, so that's that varying of pitch. And declarative speech, which means that the pitch rises, then falls. So something like, hey, Mom, come over here. Like that inflection like they hear when we're trying to get someone's attention. That also begins to happen at about 8 to 11 months. So for an example they use here, a baby with English-speaking parents will match his babbling pitch to what is heard in English. So they start to mimic the adults around them, how they talk. You might have noticed this with your children, or that they might have talked, like you talk, or even the gestures that you talk. So they're mimicking that, and that's all a precursor to real speech. So as children begin to make those sounds, those phenoms, and they begin to start to babble. So remember, they coo, then they babble, then their babble starts to have the cadence of our pitch and the rhythm that the caregivers have around them. When do they begin to form actual words? Well, children begin to understand words before they're being able to produce them. So they understand a lot more than they're able to say. So kind of like when we're learning a new language. I don't know about you, but when I learned Spanish, I definitely can understand more than I can pull out of recall, right, and be able to say correctly. So children are the same way. Children begin to understand words before being able to produce them. Children have a vocabulary of a few hundred words by age 2. So a few hundred at age 2, and at age 6 they have more than 10,000 words for their vocabulary. So that's in 4 years. They think of how many more words they accumulate. So their environment, being around in new situations, right? Their brain starts to develop to be able to make those connections to understand those words. So all that language is happening. A lot is happening from infant to 6 years old. So to begin to produce language, children must recognize that the words are symbols for objects. I talked about this a little bit earlier, right? So they have to form those concepts. We talked about the schemes and stuff kind of with Piaget. Same idea. They got to form those concepts. They have to understand that words have meaning, that the words are the symbols that we communicate to talk about actions, people, or objects. So when you're talking about stuff, you want to, explain things. You want to, be really descriptive. You want to point to them. So an example would be a furry thing that barks is a dog. So that they're categorizing that right into a scheme. So you talk a lot about that. A round thing that bounces is a ball. So they start to learn that. They start to put that in the category, the scheme of ball. So they've got that word category, that language category. And so they're starting to connect them, right? They're learning that as we talk, as we explain, as you point, that's why it's so important to not just say the word, but to say the word with the object and repeat it and to change it and remember the different directions. The ball bounces, the ball is being thrown, the ball, I catch the ball. So they learn that, the ball is the constant there. So you use gestures, you use, you make, you do all these different actions to really point out what that word means. And then the child sees that over and over and over, and they start making those connections. So children learn nouns first because they're associated with an object. They're real. So I know that is a ball. I know that is a toy. And then they learn verbs because that is more of an action. Words are more action, right? So that's harder to explain. So like, I'm running. So that's harder to get that concept. So that comes later. So nouns first, verbs second. Now, if you take, that's in English. So if you take another language like Korean or Chinese, most of their words are action words. They're kind of in the way that they're conjugated and stuff. So they learn verbs first. But in English, we learn nouns first, objects, people, places, then verbs. So after children hit about 2, they begin to learn words quite rapidly, right? Because they're going to go from a few hundred to 10,000 in 4 years. So how do they get such a huge vocabulary? Well, they learn words very rapidly, and they do that by fast mapping. And that's a child's connection between words and references that are made so quickly that he or she cannot consider all the possible meanings of the word. So what does that basically mean? Well, one of the factors involved in fast mapping is joint attention. And that's when the parent assists in labeling objects that their children show interest in. So when parents encourage word learning by carefully watching what interests their child, then when the toddler touches it or looks at the object, the parent often labels it for them. They'll say, red ball, pretty ball. You really describe it. Just like I talked about earlier, you're describing it. You're repeating that word over and over. Because the child is showing interest in it, they're going to be more attentive and put that more into their memory. And it's going to promote word learning, particularly when infants and toddlers participate actively, directing their parents' attention. So when they're really interested in it, that's when you really want to use that word over and over. You want to show it. You want to become that vocabulary because you have a child's attention. So they're going to really lay down those connections. And just remember, after, children develop the insight that a word can symbolize an object or an action, so that's putting the meaning to the word, their vocabularies will grow. And they'll use this fast mapping to quickly make decisions when they couldn't consider all the possibilities. And just remember that a typical 15-month-old, for example, may learn 2 to 3 new words each week. However, just in 3 months, an 18-month children experience a naming explosion, which they learn new words more rapidly than before. Children learn 10 or more new words each week. So that's when that fast mapping really comes in to play. And remember, 18 months is a special age, right? It's when theory of the mind starts to come in. You start to realize that, you start to become aware of yourself. You start to really become with your language. You really start to acquire a lot of language. So you really start to interact with your environment and things start to really have meaning. So 18 months is a really special age to acquire cognition, sense of self, and language skills. So joint attention simplifies word meaning for children. But the problem remains. How do toddlers tell the difference between an object and the verb? So if I say, touch banana, how do they know that the banana is banana and not touch? So that's one of the problems that, when we're teaching and we're saying words, how do we, how we can say an object, but when we describe it and use adverbs and, action, how do they not know that that's not the noun? So they start to form simple rules with language, and then they put those little rules in the category of their brains, and they start to learn patterns, and then they start to be able to categorize them and to determine what the meaning of those words are. So basically that's constraint on word names. So if an unfamiliar word is heard along with objects that already have names and some that don't, the word refers to the objects that don't have names. So an example of that would be, I have 5 stuffed animals and 4 of them are monkeys and 1 is a bear. And I point to all the monkeys. And then I ask the child, where's the bear? Well, the child can use his logic, can start to realize it has a simple rule that I know what a monkey is. You pointed and told me where a monkey is. So because I know what a monkey is, the last one is not a monkey. So therefore it has to be the bear. So they're making kind of a backwards assumption. They know the truth on the monkeys, they know that word, and the unfamiliar word has to be what they're asking. So that's one of those simple rules. Another simple rule is children follow other rules to label the entire object, not just one of its parts. So for the example they used in their book, they said that a grandparent may point to a stuffed animal, and we can say maybe a dinosaur or even that bear. And the children know that the dinosaur refers to the whole parts of it. It's the whole thing, not just the nose, not the tail. So dinosaur isn't just tail. They know that a tail, a head, a nose, all that whole body makes up what's considered a dinosaur. It's not specific to a body part. So that's another simple rule. So children follow other rules to label the entire object, not just one of its parts. So they know that a dinosaur makes up all those components. A third rule that toddlers use to determine what you're talking about when you're starting to label to learn vocabulary. Is if an object already has a name and another name is presented, the new name denotes a subcategory of the original name. So if the child knows the meaning of the word dinosaur, they know what a dinosaur is, right? And they see their brother point to another dinosaur and hears the brother say T-Rex. The child will know that a T-Rex is a special kind of dinosaur. So he knows that it's still the same thing, shape, looks like a dinosaur. It's just a subcategory. So they can tell the difference. That's a kind of putting it into, that context. And then another example is given many similar category members, a word applied consistently to only one of them is a proper noun. So let's take that dinosaur again. So if I have this dinosaur we know it's a dinosaur, and they say that it's a dinosaur in the group of dinosaurs, we call that one Dino. And we would say, hey Dino, the child will conclude that Dino is the dinosaur's name. So when they hear consistently to only one of the dinosaurs. So say I have 6 dinosaurs and I say look at all the dinosaurs. And then I say, this is Dino and this is Bubba and this is, Billy. But look at the dinosaurs. The child would be like, oh, I know that they're all dinosaurs. So he's putting again in another category. I know that they're all dinosaurs. So that must be its name. So those are the constraints on word names. So you can figure out by process of elimination if you have, 5 objects and 4 are the same, then I can determine the word that I don't know has to be that 5th object, or has to be the unknown object. Or if I call something, I point to a stuffed animal like that dinosaur, and I call it a dinosaur, the child knows that the dinosaur is a whole and not just its parts. So everything that makes up a dinosaur from its tail, nose, and eyes is a dinosaur. And then if they see different contexts of different sizes, still same shape, but I call it a T-Rex to a raptor, then the child starts to realize, okay, they're still the same dinosaur, but they're a subcategory that I can name now. And then the last one, remember, is that if I have a bunch of dinosaurs and I say, I establish with the child that they're dinosaurs, and then I start calling them specific names, Dino, Billy, Bob, then the child knows that, oh, that's the name of the dinosaur. So if that's how it starts, they just start putting into categories. And it doesn't happen overnight, but then they start learning. They start to see that repetition and that consistency. So that's the key in learning language, repetition and consistency. And they'll discover these simple patterns, and then they'll be able to apply it to all different types of objects. So then they learn the rules and then they apply it to different objects. And also there's sentence cues, so that example is juggling, given meaning in the context of the sentence when children see it in action. So to be able to do that, they have to use words they already know, and then they can put the verb in there that's unfamiliar. So still think of that idea of constraints on words, but now they're using it to find out the verb. So if they say the man is juggling, and the child already knows what a man is, he can say, oh, juggling must be what the action of him doing, and they see him juggling. So it's still using the idea of unfamiliar word and identifying it because you know the familiar word. But now you're using that to identify the verb. So first you learn the nouns that way, and once you have some vocabulary with nouns, then you can put those nouns that are known into action, and the child will start to pick up what those action verb words are. And then they start to build a full vocabulary of nouns and verbs, and they have these simple rules that they've placed in their schemes in their brain that they can pull and map so that they can predict that fast mapping, predict categories, predict things that they may not have been exposed to, because they have these simple rules and they can choose based on these rules, and now that makes them understand things faster and be able to respond faster, and that gets better with age. So what are some factors in learning new words? Well, one of the first factors is cognitive factors. Language becomes a means to achieve goals and relay intentions. So remember I talked about earlier that the child is trying to understand that these sounds are symbols for the environment around them. So they're symbols for an object, a person, a place, a thing, an object. So when they can attach those words to meaning, that have goals and intentions, so they know that, oh, when she says throw the ball, the goal is to throw the ball over there. So they're attaching a meaning to a goal and intention. So as the language becomes more cognitive, they can start understanding the process. Then they're going to learn new words faster, and language is going to become a lot more advanced. And this happens as the brain grows. And as we know, the brain grows rapidly during this time. So that's why it's so important to really put a lot of language type skills with children. Reading, mimicking, repeating words. So they hear everything that an adult has part of language, so that they can start making those connections. The earlier they make those connections, the better they're going to be with understanding language, not just oral language, but when it comes to writing as well. Developmental change in word learning. So remember, before 18 months, children rely on simple attentional processes to name objects. But that 18 months is that very special age, right? They're going to start learning more, put more meaning into the words, because they're more aware of their self and their self in the environment. And they're understanding, they have a greater vocabulary, so they're able to put meaning to the words. And at 24 months, they use language and social cues. So they start to understand that words have intention. If they want something, right, at 2 years old, they can say, I want milk, or they'll say no. And they'll be able to do social cues. They'll act out or gesture, right? So a lot is happening in that early stages. Between 18 and 24 months is a really crucial age. So just remember that with language, they first associate single meaning to an object, right? So this is a cup. So they just understand the cup. And then as they hear the word and they see it in their environment, they start to put it into categories, and they say anything that has a similar shape must be a cup. So that's how they start. It's simply just one language, and then they can apply it to multiple objects. Cups come in very many different colors, sizes, shapes, but then they can begin to, as they start to develop that cognitive factors, then they can be able to understand and apply those into their schemes, okay? One of the things you want to understand at this time, because they're making so many connections and trying to get that vocabulary, they're going to underextend and overextend meanings to words. So underextension is an example is when you use the word cat for the family pet, but you don't apply it, to other cats. So they're basically taking that word for cat and just using it as, oh, that's just, a cat is just our pet. They can't apply it to, every time I see a cat, anything that looks like a cat, different shapes, that's a cat. No, they're thinking they're underextending it. They're not giving it enough meaning, and they're just associating it. A cat is our pet, and that's all it can be. Overextension, an example would be when a child refers to all animals as doggy, or refers to a lion as a kitty. So they're saying that they're grouping it too big, right? So all animals aren't dogs. Dogs are animals, but not all animals are dogs. And definitely, a kitty is very, very, very far removed from a lion. So they're just making a very general observation, and they're overextending that definition. So just remember, as they're starting to, because they're accumulating this vocabulary so fast, they're going to make mistakes. And sometimes the mistake is underextension, which is they're applying it too specific. Like my pet, like a cat is only my pet, instead of cat can be all different sizes of shapes. Or overextension, which is they're making a too general statement. that, all animals are dogs. Well, that's not true, right? Or a kitten is a lion. So think of it in that terms. They're going to make mistakes. Underextend, they're going to be too specific. Overextend, they're going to be too general. So I talked earlier about how infants learn sounds, right? And really early on, they are open because our brains are just never have heard sounds, and we're listening to all the sounds, how they can hear all the sounds of various languages and really process it. And it's not until about 10 to 12 months that they start to talk and, block out the other sounds to be efficient in their native language. But what happens when you teach a child to be bilingual, when you're hearing two languages consistently enough to develop, both sounds? Well, that's a good question. So how do bilingual children learn to speak in two languages? That's a lot, right? So first, they start off slowly at first, right? Because they're taking in two different sounds. Remember, we talked about how some languages don't even have sounds, like, Japan doesn't have an R and an L, so they don't even hear that sound, what we use in English language. So their brain can't process it, their mouths have a hard time forming the word, so it's hard to learn. So if they're learning it at the same time, they may be learning way more sounds than just an English-speaking child would. They have to learn the different sounds for the different languages. So they have to start slowly. They're going to mix sounds and words from both languages. So they're going to talk they're learning Spanish and English, maybe a Spanglish, because they're hearing, they can't, so just think about the person learning one language, they're trying to find those simple rules and patterns. Well, if you're learning two languages and you're trying to find the simple words and patterns, you're going to mix them up, right? You're going to mix the sounds up. You're not going to get it quite right, early on, but you're going to learn them both. So the brain's going to start laying down those patterns, and eventually it'll start putting them into the right categories, the right schemes. But at first, you're going to mix up the sounds and words from both languages. But soon, like I said, you're going to learn to separate the languages. You're going to put them in those schemes and categorize them to the correct language, and then you're going to be able to progress at the same rate as in a person's monolingual children. So they're going to catch up. So that's why it's so important, if you can, teach your kids in two languages young, because remember, they're like a clean slate. Their brain has not decided what normal sounds they should learn. They're open to all sounds. So if you start that early and you make those categories, those schemes in there, the brain's going to become very efficient and proficient and hearing those sounds, being able to form those sounds, and being able to learn both languages. And they tend to have a smaller vocabulary for each language, but a larger overall vocabulary, which makes sense, right? Because they've got to learn, they're basically just learning words or symbols for objects, places, things, and verbs. So they have to learn it double. So of course they're going to have, less in each language, but overall they're going to have way more words because they're going to know the word for bear in two languages, right? So, and as time goes, they're just going to become more proficient and have more vocabulary. So they're going to have a better understanding of words and arbitrary symbols because they're learning two different languages that have two, learning that an object can have two meanings. It can be this language and another language. So an object is just represented by some arbitrary word, depending on the language you choose. So they have a good concept of that. And they're more skilled at switching back and forth between tasks because they have to switch back and forth between languages. So their brain's just has learned that skill because it's learned it early on, and it's the way that it has to interact. So it's just a skill that transfers over to other things. And they're better at inhibiting inappropriate responses because they have to stop and pause and process to understand what language they're going to pull out. So it just gives them a skill to process things before they speak. So that helps in inhibiting an inappropriate response because their brain is naturally taught to pause and process before speaking. So it gives them some real skills by learning two languages early, not just in the language acquisition skills, but actually how to communicate. You think before you speak. You're better, have better attention switching between multitasker, and you can understand things maybe in a more arbitrary way. So a lot of benefits to learning two languages very early on. So just like adults, children learn differently, right? We have different styles of learning. I'm sure you've gone over how you learn, what's the best way for you to learn. Well, we start that in our childhood by learning language. So let's go over some of the ways that children learn language. So the first one is referential style. And basically that means vocabularies consist mostly of words that name people, objects, or actions. So you would say that is a ball. Means learning and talking about objects, right? We're talking about what that object does. We're talking about that person. We're talking about throwing the ball. Language is primarily an intellectual tool. So we're talking about facts and action and things that happen. We're conveying information. It's very intellectual. Expressive style is more about, your feelings. Vocabularies that contain some names, but also social phrases, like concepts, right? I want it. It's an action of not actually doing it. It's kind of like I want it. So it's kind of more of an abstract idea. And language is used as a social tool. So expressive style is more social, phrases. And just remember, referential is intellectual. It's the facts. I'm knowing the facts. I want to know who it was, what they did, and the object that was involved. So referential and expressive. And then together, it allows us to communicate, right? We want to communicate with facts and feelings and needs, and it makes us a whole person. So as some children will learn one style more than the other, and you probably know that. There's children are very literal. That's a ball. They can't, they don't talk about like express their feelings. And then some children are so feeling, right? Oh, I love you. Oh, I need this. Oh, and then they can't talk about, describe the facts. So the best thing is to be, balanced in that, but you can definitely practice those skills if you're, unbalanced in that. But those are the two ways, learning styles, children learn language. So when we think of who are the infant, toddlers' main source of language acquisition, who do they get it from? It's the parents, the caregivers, right? So it's your job or the job of the parent to encourage language growth by speaking to their children often and naming objects of interest. So if a child's interested in it, you need to say it. So remember our rules that we learned. You need to say it, point to it, repeat it, and use it in various situations. So if I'm talking about the ball, I want to point to the red ball. Look at the red ball. I throw the red ball. I bounce the red ball. I hug the red ball. So I put it in 3 different actions so that they can tell that, oh, the word that I'm keeping the same is ball. It must be the object. I've repeated it numerous times, 3 or 4 or 5 times, and I'm always pointing to it. So I'm always doing that referencing. So parents, caregivers, that's how the child is going to learn best. So if you're going to teach a parent or remind them about their language, you can teach them some of these skills. And the way you can do a lot of this, reading books, watching educational videos with children also helps. So Sesame Street they use here as an example. My daughter loved leapfrog videos, which talk about having you learn your phonics and your sounds and your vocabulary. She took off when she saw that. And she was probably about 18 months to 2. So that's one I highly recommend. But we're going to actually have some fun in our discussion group. I'm going to show you videos of different children's programs, and you're going to evaluate them and see which one best has the best learning styles for referential style, for expressive style, for stimulating that brain. So your job is actually going to determine what TV shows are best for learning language. So that'll be fun. So I'll have more information on that in your discussion group. But I want you to think about these things, how I talked about how a child and infant learns and what is needed to really lay down that language to turn it from just sounds to meaning. Okay, so that's what's the important thing. And you can think of some baby videos that promote infant word learning are not as beneficial. So They have found that before 18 months, there's no real benefit on baby videos. That's just what the study shows. Children vary depending on how they're acquiring language. So some, have that acquisition a little bit earlier. But remember that 18 months is that key age because they're getting that self-awareness. And once they have that self-awareness, they're able to understand themselves and the environment, and then they're able to put meaning to the symbols of the words. So the words begin to have meaning because they understand themselves and their environment. They understand that they are a part of the environment just like that object is. So thing to remember that before 18 months, studies have shown that baby videos that promote infant word learning have really not had any benefit. And when they have done studies, they've shown that children learn best when an action is with the word. So that's why I say changing that, doing something with the object, throwing the ball, bouncing the ball, hugging the ball, so that the child always has the reference that the ball is the same and the action is different. So they will learn what the object's word is. So now we're going to go on and talk about speaking in sentences. So now we've talked about how an infant first hears sounds, how they start to interpret those sounds and gradually get them to understand that those sounds put together are words, and words put together are sentences, and those words have meanings. And they start to understand. They begin to speak language with cooing first, then babbling, and then they start to, form 10,000 words by age 6. Okay, so now they're speaking, they're understanding some language. But how do we introduce grammar? Grammar is a really hard thing, right? Even some of us have not the greatest grammar, but it's so important for them to learn it early on so that it sets for later on. So some of the basic parts of grammatical development are that children can produce 2-word sentences with basic formulas. So we first learn, right? Gimme cookie, Timmy sleep. So almost 2 words. So the action and the noun, right? So very, very basic grammar. Then the sentences begin to progress. By the time they're 3 years old, they may have sentences with 10 or more words. And their sentences still lack the quality of adults, so not as complex, but they're more complex than 2 words, right? And they have different types of speech as well. So they have telegraphic speech, which includes only words directly relevant to the meaning. And they lack some grammatical morphemes, which are words or ends of words that make a sentence grammatically correct. So like they may, not put an ing on the back of it. They may use past tense for future, like I ran down the street. They're not using the correct conjugation of the verb. They're not grammatically correct in their morphs. But they know that they have the correct meaning of it. They're just not grammatically using it correct. So the formula is actor plus action is mommy sleep, Timmy run. Action plus object is gimme cookie, throw ball. And then they have possessor plus possession is Kimmy spell, Maya shovel. So that is the basic formula. And then as they progress, they get telegraphic speech, which is a form of communication consisting of simple 2-word long sentences, often composed of a noun and a verb that adhere to the grammatical standards of the culture's language. For example, mommy see or sissy draw. And then we go to, having difficulty with having some of the grammatical morphs, which is just putting the wrong tense. I ran down the street instead of, I ran, or, I am baked this cookie instead of I am baking this cookie. They lack some of those grammatical rules, right? Morphs. So just because they haven't, laid down those patterns yet in the brain, they haven't learned those rules. They're a little bit more complex rule. So grammar is a little bit more complex of a rule, so they have to learn. And especially if anybody, we've learned the English language, we're one of the hardest languages to learn because we have a lot of words that just don't make sense and you have to memorize. So that's part of the reason why grammar, learning it early is so much easier and sets in for having success during later development. So like I said, English has highly irregular grammar, right? A lot of memorization. So kids are going to get it wrong at first because it doesn't follow those simple patterns that they've learned. And then they just have to start to memorize. And if they don't memorize those rules of grammar, then it becomes much more difficult later on. So one of the things that English language has is over-regularizations. So that's what happens is that children start to apply grammatical rules to words that are the exceptions to the rule, right? We've heard that so many times in learning, that this is the exception to the rule. So it's kind of like I was talking about it earlier, referring, when you have two men, it's not mans, it's men. And it's not I goed home, I went home. But it doesn't follow the rule, right? So that is over-regularization. So they'll just make all these assumptions because of what that simple rule they learned for grammar, instead of all those over-regularizations where we have to just memorize it because they're exceptions to the rules. So with all that said, how do we acquire grammar? I mean, because we don't always speak grammatically correct, and in writing they're not going to be doing for a while. So according to behaviorists, children imitate the grammar that they hear. So if you have a lot of flaws in your grammar, your children are probably going to pick up those same flaws. Many sentences are novel. Language is too complex to learn by imitation, right? So we do not speak like we write all the time, right? We're not like flowing, grammatically correct all the time. We use slang words, right? So children just imitating grammar that they hear, you're going to see a lot of mistakes. So that's the flaw in that. Many sentences are, novel. Language is too complex to learn just by imitation. So according to linguists, children are born with mechanisms that guide the learning of grammar. So they believe that children are born with these mechanisms that simplify the task of learning grammar. And according to this view, children are born with brain circuits for inferring the grammar of their native language. Grammar is not built in the child's nervous system, but processes that guide the learning of grammar are. So remember when we talked about your brain is completely developed when you come out. You're just going to stimulate it to pull in all those, connections and make it work. So you've got the hard drive, you got to program it. So basically they're saying that your brain, so these linguists believe that your brain is hardwired for the grammar of your language that you need to learn. You just need the stimulus. You need the actual language to make those connections. It's already there. You just have to program it to work. So that's what linguists believe. Certain brain areas are specialized for language. Non-humans cannot be taught to fully understand grammar, so they don't have those areas of the brain. And birth to 12 years is crucial because that's when you're laying down all those connections. And if you don't lay down those connections, you'll have difficulty later on in years to mastering grammar, particularly if you do not acquire language in this period. They found that after 12, if you do not have a mastery of the language, that you're never really going to get the mastery of grammar. Because if you can't understand how the language works, grammar is, is the way that all the rules of how to put those words together, and you're not going to fully be able to grasp that and have a mastery of it. If you do not get language, adequate mastery of skills by age 12. So that is linguist. Now, the cognitive theorists believe that cognitive skills detect regularities in an environment, language patterns included. So when children listen and hear this speech, they establish kind of a spreadsheet in their brain that has the speech they've heard in one column and the context in which they heard it in another. And then they'll scan kind of the columns and put them together. So that's kind of what cognitive theorists believe. They have a kind of this big spreadsheet in the brain that they detect when something's regular. They'll put the context, with the speech, and they'll make those connections. So the example your book uses, the children may be first confused when they hear S added to the end of a familiar noun, like, toys. But however, as they start hearing it with, a bunch of nouns, toys, boys, cars, planes, then they start to put that into their spreadsheet, and then they create a rule. So with this view, children learn language by searching for regularities. So if things are regular, so all those rules that just add all those words that just add a S, those become set in their little spreadsheet brain and in their memory, but not through an inborn. They're not born with that grammar device in there. They just develop their own patterns. Remember those schemes, and they categorize it by rules. So those cognitive theorists are the schemes, the patterns, but you're not necessarily born with the language, grammar center. You're just creating the rules as you go. And then the final idea is the social interaction theory, and they believe that adults and children work together to promote language. And this complements the other two by emphasizing that much of language learning takes place in the context of interactions between children and adults, with both parties, eager to communicate. So basically they're saying you can't have acquisition of language if you're not having some interaction with another person, right? So, and both people have to be engaged in wanting to either learn or be taught. So that'll enhance both the linguist and the cognitive, because without this social interaction, children aren't going to, to learn. So you learn a bunch of different things with that, how to take turns, how to not talk over each other, how to, the social skill of speaking, right? That how do we know when to pause and ask a question and let the other person answer? How do we know the difference between a question and just a statement? So that is social interaction, and it actually helps the other two. It's not just learning grammar, it's the etiquette of speech. So the help of this sort is needed less often. By age 2, they start to develop that. They start to mimic and understand, and they understand spontaneous turn-taking and all that, common conversations. By the age of 3, children have progressed to the point that when a listener fails to reply promptly, like so if you ask 3-year-old asks you a question, they are going to repeat the remark to elicit response, and they're going to keep the conversation moving. So it's the art of conversation, the art of speaking, and the art of language is that social interaction. And then linguists and cognitive theories have the ideas of how do we process that information. So remember, linguists believe that we have a center already hardwired for it in our brain, and cognitive believe that we use our environment and we find patterns, and then we find those patterns and we put them in the schemes and find the regularities, and we just apply that. So that's how we develop grammar according to the different theorists. Know the difference and be able to speak to all three, and know how they differ, and maybe how social interaction can be pulled in for both of those. So I just want to remind you what we kind of talked about: 3 key elements for successful oral communication. People take turns talking and listening. Parents encourage turn taking. We talked about that. You pause and you let the other person talk. Speech should be clear for the listener. So you teach preschoolers to learn to give more information to listeners who are not familiar with what they are talking about. So the first conversations you may have with a toddler may just be about themselves. I have a toy. I played today. You're going to encourage them. Well, what did you do with the toy? Who did you play with? So tell me all about it. So you're going to teach them how to describe, how to give information that listener, because they weren't there, may not understand. So you're teaching them to be more descriptive. And you're going to find out that they're going to teach them listeners should let speakers know if the remarks don't make sense. So if a child says, red toy, and you're like, well, what about the red toy? I don't know what you mean. It's like, oh, I played with the red toy. So they're going to teach them that if I don't understand what you're saying, I'm going to clarify. So some key ages and milestones with this. Post 1-year-old, parents should encourage the child to participate in turn taking. So about 1 year is when they have the brain capacity to do it. And by 3, if the listener does not, like I talked about in the earlier slide, reply promptly, the child's going to repeat and the remark to elicit a response. So they know that they're supposed to get an answer, and they're going to repeat that until they do it. So those are the 3 key elements for successful oral communication. And, we do it naturally. We learn to take turns. We are taught clear so that they understand. And when we don't understand something, we ask for clarification. Toddlers and children, they have to learn that. And the way they learn that is through social interaction from their parents and their caregivers on, there is a way that we communicate effectively, and there's some etiquette. So those are those 3 elements of how we just talk normally. We have to teach our toddlers. And you probably, like I have had some people that don't obey the successful oral communication. They talk over people, they interrupt, they don't speak clearly. So some of us could need to go back to being when we were 3, right, and learn these skills again. So again, here is just a great table to study from, how we communicate with others, right? The age and the milestones. So we're going to kind of put all this lecture into a big little nutshell. So birth to 1 year, remember babies hear those phonemes from birth. Those are the sounds. So those are your consonants and vowels. So when you hear that word or see that word, you're going to think sounds, consonants, and vowels. They begin to coo between 2 and 4, then babble at about 6 months old. So it's hear the sound, coo, and then babble. At about their first birthday, babies begin to talk and gesture, showing that they have begun to use symbols. So that's when they start, using their hands, start to mimic your sounds and cadence. Ba 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 da 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 go ba ba. They make no sense, but they're using their hands. They're putting different pitches and stuff on on their sounds to act like they're talking. They're mimicking a conversation. That's their first birthday. From 1 to 3, the vocabulary expands rapidly. So remember, they learn hundreds of words due to that fast mapping. So that's remember when we talked about all the constraints and how they learn what words are associated with objects? Go back and review that. So that's how they can make quick decisions on that is a bear out of 4 monkeys, or that's a T-Rex out of 4 different types of dinosaurs. Review that. That really becomes strong at 18 months. Remember, that glorious 18 months is the key to that self-awareness and being able to understand language. 2-word sentences start to emerge in telegraphic speech at about 18 months. And more complex sentences are evident by 3 years. So turn-taking is evident in communication by 2 years. So those are those key milestones. You're going to want to know all these for the test. 3 to 5 years, vocabulary continues to expand, because remember, we're going to get up to 10,000 words by 6 years old. You're now going to start learning grammar morphs. So you're going to learn those simple rules. And what is the English language? Has tons of irregularities. So you're going to learn rules, and then you're going to learn the exception to the rules. So that makes English very hard, right? Children begin to adjust their speech to listeners. So they're starting to learn how others talk, and they're going to change their tone or their cadence appropriately for how others talk. But as listeners, they often ignore problems and messages they receive, right? They're still not comprehending completely because they don't understand all the subtleties of language. So they may not get all the information. They may overextend or underextend, or they ignore problems in the grammar and the message they receive. So look at this table. It's a great review on the major milestones of language and how they progress, because that's definitely going to be some questions on the exam. So a quick review. So how do we support early language learning? So what's the bottom line? We've got to apply this, right? You want to support early language learning. So what we've learned with infants, they respond to coos and babbles. You want to establish that joint attention. You want to use infant-directed speech, and you want to play social games. So you want to use that slow, infant-directed speech, really pronunciating your words, really paying attention, that joint attention to the object, using it in different actions. You want to respond to the coos and babbles, give them that feedback that their sounds are good. So you want to do that. Social games, peekaboo, playing with the objects, saying the objects, repeating the objects. That's how we're going to apply with our infants how we're going to develop those language skills. So now as they progress to toddlers, so they're going to have, we're going to really build that vocabulary. So you want to think about toddlers, we're building the vocabulary and setting the ground rules for grammar and speech, communication, speech, and turn taking. So you want to engage in joint make-believe. So make-believe, with in their environment just to simulate, new vocabulary. We'll play kitchen, we'll play hardware store, we'll play, mechanic, we'll play doctor. It's going to introduce new vocabulary, new situations. It's going to develop those language and meaning skills. And engage in frequent conversations. They need repetition, repetition, repetition. Practice, practice, practice. Putting those objects, nouns, verbs in different situations so that they can start to put those meaning to the words and make those categories. And so they can start to learn those grammar patterns as well. And read often and talk about books. It's the best way to learn vocabulary. They're going to see it, hear it, and eventually they will read it at one point. And if you start that early, then their brain is already laying down all those connections. So remember, it has the hardware. So if you make so many tons of connections, when they get to the next step, their brain is going to fire so much quicker, and they're going to be making learning so much easier. So that's the application of why it's so important, and how we can really help children and infants. And if you're going to be working with young children, or even if you have young children, this is stuff that you can take with you and really apply. And then these are just going to be the clips I will have in your discussion group and in the supplemental videos of the shows that I will assign you to watch. So again, you'll be assigned by your name, and then you're going to analyze them for their ability on specific language cues, and I'll give you a whole setup. So thanks for listening, Chapter 4. This is going to be a great week. I can't wait to read your discussion groups. So just remember, this is language and how we establish it and how we learn and how we do that cognitive development in the infant and toddler, and how important it is for future development. So we'll always be referring to this as we go through and learn the other stages of development. It all is based in this early development. That's why child early development and education is so important, because it sets the framework for our adolescents, teenage, and even adults. So I'll see you later. I will have things posted this week. I'll give you your little pre and post of week 3 and week 4, and I will start talking about that poster presentation topic sentence. So see you guys, and have a great week.